I'm Margot Beasley. I'm the chair of the Blackheath History Forum. First, I'd like to say, as we always do, that Blackheath is located in the country of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, and the Blackheath History Forum recognises that Darug and Gundungurra traditional owners have a continuous and deep connection to their country, and that this is of great cultural significance to Aboriginal people, both locally and in the region. We pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise the strength, capacity and resilience of past and present Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Blue Mountains region. Okay, so welcome everyone today to, I think this is our sixth presentation in the Blackheath History Forum's 2020 season, which we've been bringing to you online because of the problems with COVID, which we're all very aware of. If you want to ask questions or make comments, please follow the instructions that should appear on the far right of the screen. If you go into the public comments, there are two columns on the right of the screen. One's private chat, I think it's called, the other one's public, or comments, might just say comments. This talk will go for about 50 minutes and then we'll go to questions or discussion or comments for about half an hour. So today I'm extremely happy to introduce to you Patrick Mullins, author of the splendidly titled Tiberius of the Telephone, a biography of our now quite long gone but in no way forgotten former Prime Minister Billy McMahon. So Patrick, thank you very much.
Thanks, Margot. I want to begin today by first of all recalling and thanking you for inviting me to speak with you. Back in 2014, when I first began working on this book on Billy McMahon, the initial reaction from most people when I told them that I was doing so was one of shock, of horror, of some concern for my mental health, of some kind of wonder about why anyone would want to spend anything more than a waking second thinking about Billy McMahon. One journalist who I telephoned actually to try and get to speak with me to interview kind of laughed down the phone and just refused to believe that anyone would want to write a biography of Billy. So it's tremendously heartening that A, the book could get published, but B, that people would want to actually listen to me talk about it. My wife at the moment certainly does not. So thank you to the Blackheath History Forum for inviting me, and thank you for tuning in to listen to this talk. Biographers will often observe that there are two tracks to a subject and a subject's life and to a biography. The first is the track concerning with the subject individually. That is, them as an individual person, their life, their times, the events, the actions that make them notable and worthy of a biography. The second track is the wider cultural history that subject weaves through. Just like a spotlight, while it's trained on a single figure, biography generally takes in much, much more. It takes in more of the stage. And Billy McMahon, in my view, is such a figure. His life weaves through the 20th century. He goes through Australia's political and cultural landscape, interacting with significant figures and exerting significant influence on events. And so my thought when I was writing this book was that a whole chronicle of Australian political life in the 20th century could hang on the thread of McMahon's experiences. That's the argument, in effect, of my book, and the argument I'm going to try and present today in this talk. And we can see this, I think, starting off straight away with the way that McMahon came to politics. McMahon was born in 1908 to a wealthy, middle to upper class Sydney family. His father was a solicitor. His grandfather was James Butty McMahon, a wealthy carrier based in Redfern who had emigrated from Ireland during the potato famine. He was nicknamed Butty for his propensity to headbutt people who opposed him, who antagonised him. And generally they were labour organising unionists. Butty McMahon crossed swords with Billy Hughes quite a few times. On McMahon's mother's side, his mother was the daughter of a canvas factory owner based also in Redfern. So he had quite a bit of a mix in some respects in terms of heritage. His father's side was Irish, his mother's side was English. McMahon had a materially comfortable early life, but it was one that was very early on blighted by death. His mother died when he was 10, his brother died when he was 11, his father died by then a drunk and a gambler, by the time McMahon was 17. And one of the first effects of this was that McMahon was sent to live with his uncle, Sir Samuel Walder, who was at that time had taken over the family business running that factory, but it was also moving into politics. Walder became Lord Mayor of Sydney during the height of the Depression, and he was intimately involved with the United Australia Party. So the big first consequence of McMahon coming to Sir Samuel Walder's home and to his guidance was that McMahon absorbed even more that non-Labor political outlook, that conservative political orthodoxy. And it was reinstilled over and over again throughout McMahon's life and his career. The second point about this that I want to make is that it makes McMahon align with a pattern discernible in politics of politicians who have lost parents at a very young age. This was a pattern noticed by the British historian Lucille Iremonger, who called it the Phaeton complex. And her theory was that people who lost their parents at a young age were bereft of the security and the love that a parent can offer. And so in later life, they manifest an anxiety and insecurity that they seek to make up for or to repair by the power of public office and by the adulation of the public. So they go into politics to find the love they could never have as a child. McMahon, by the death of his parents, I think aligns very much with this pattern. And I think very much that his subsequent actions in politics show that he was anxious and insecure. I think that it underlines the credibility of that theory. The third consequence of McMahon going to Sir Samuel Walder's home is that McMahon was turned from the Catholicism of his father's family to the Anglicanism of the Walders. That is, he became a member of the Church of England. It was also by Walder's hand that McMahon had an establishment education. He went to Sydney Grammar School, then to University of Sydney, where he stayed at St. Paul's College. And it was after that that he came to Allen and Hemsley, an establishment Sydney law firm, where he came under the guidance of Sir Norman Cowper. So, in effect, McMahon, by attending all of these institutions, was brought very close to the networks of power in Sydney. He was taking up an occupation that was going to be a lucrative one, of high status, that was going to bring him into circles that were going to be a benefit to him in the future. And he gained a considerable amount of experience while working at Allen and Hemsley. He was working for the Bank of New South Wales and for the Commercial Bank. And he actually became a partner there when he was 31, which is quite an achievement, I think, even with connections like that. The conservative politics that McMahon had absorbed from his uncle, moreover, were reinforced by his time at Allen's. Allen and Hemsley was at this time very much a conservative establishment black-letter law firm. Sorry. McMahon was brought into the worlds of commerce and finance, and he was encountering a lot of political figures. Visitors to the office during the Great Depression, when McMahon was working at Allen and Hemsley, included people like Sir Thomas Bevan, Bertram Stephen. They included former Prime Minister S.M. Bruce. They even included a future Prime Minister in the form of Robert Menzies, who was briefed by Allen and Hemsley during litigation over reinforced paper bags. By the late 1930s, however, McMahon had become kind of restless. He was always something of a social butterfly and a playboy as a young man. And he originally had actually intended to go to the bar, but because he had suffered a partial hearing loss as a young man, he'd been forced to stay as a solicitor, to stay at Allen and Hemsley. So it was this restlessness that began to manifest after a couple of years that actually led him to change his life, in effect. He became dissatisfied by the cloister of the office, and when World War II broke out in 1939, he enlisted. Because of his deafness, he was not able to go and serve in combat. He remained an aide-de-camp staying in Australia. But he was even at this point thinking about a political career. His uncle was insistent on him thinking about it. And McMahon, in fact, remained close enough to Sydney to scope out Sydney pre-selections for the United Australia Party at the 1943 election. He didn't stand at that election for pre-selection, which was probably for the best considering the whirlwind that the UAP received at the 1943 election. But it did show that by the end, McMahon was quite intent on a political career. Once World War II was over, McMahon was already studying at the University of Sydney for an economics degree. He was also intent on travelling. He went over to the United States after the World War II had ended to get an operation for his hearing. unsuccessful, didn't in the end fix it. But it also allowed him to go over to Europe and study and tour the war-torn countries there. So by the time he came back to Australia late in the 1940s, he could say, I've got an economics degree, I've got a law degree, I have got all these connections within the worlds of finance and law. I also have seen communism up close. I've seen the effects of fascism up close. I've seen war. I know what it's like. So in effect, he had a great amount of credibility to him. And this, of course, made him an attractive candidate for pre-selection, which he put his name forward for in 1949. This was the great election at which the Liberal Party would come to power, and McMahon stood for one of the new seats at that election that was established, the seat of Low. And it was at this point that his uncle guidance was really, really redeemed. One of the first questions he was asked at the pre-selection was, "Are you a Tyke?" So McMahon, going from the Catholicism of his father's family to the Anglicanism of the Walders, now had a home in the Liberal Party. He received pre-selection and he came to power in the House of Representatives in 1949. And I think it's worth saying here that all of the things that had happened to McMahon before this had made him a model political candidate. He had a kind of track record that was just far and beyond anybody else's. The 2 decades that followed that are at the heart of my biography. This is the years of Menzies, of Holt, of Gorton, and of McMahon himself. McMahon would later say that this whole era should be called the Menzies to McMahon, the end to an end. Within a few months of his election, McMahon had begun to win influences, begun to win friends, and had begun to actually get himself ahead. The journalist Alan Reid, who worked for the Australian Consolidated Press, had at this point assessed that McMahon was a bright young star and somebody worth paying attention to. He believed that McMahon was actually one of this country's first professional politicians, in the sense that he didn't regard it as something that you did idly, that rather it was something that you did as a full-throated struggle, a full battle in which all sorts of methods were acceptable. McMahon's relationship with Alan Reid was to become notorious, but so too, and in particular value, was his relationship with Frank Packer. In the 1930s, McMahon had invested in a small company called Sydney Newspapers Limited, which had been started by Packer to take over an ailing union-run newspaper. It was a ploy that was designed to scratch at the instincts of another newspaper proprietor, and it ended up actually netting Packer a huge amount of money. And that money that Packer earned in that deal became the nucleus of the Australian Women's Weekly. It became the seed money for that magazine, which of course, as we know, became a massive success and became the bedrock on which Australian Consolidated Press, Packer's media empire, was built. So McMahon had this long-standing relationship with Sir Frank Packer from early on, and he had a vital ally from very early on in his political career. Packer never forgot the investment, and he would wield clout in service of McMahon's career for years afterward. Within 18 months of being elected, McMahon was on the front bench in the Menzies government as the Minister for Navy and Air, and displaying the characteristics that colleagues would become all too familiar with: a willingness to manipulate and to background, an ambition and unbound by loyalty, and ability as well to work very quickly, to understand very quickly, to work hard, and to kind of contribute to debate and to persist in spite of obstacles that might have waylaid lesser men. He was attentive to his ministerial responsibilities, so much so that he in fact handed care of electoral matters over to a long-time Liberal field officer, who was then nicknamed the real member for Low. If you ever wanted something done in Low, you went to see him. You didn't go to see Billy McMahon. McMahon was useless on that front. McMahon was also adept with the media. He was very aware of the opportunities that the media presented for publicity. And one example of that comes in 1954 when he was shifted to the Home Affairs, to the Social Securities portfolio. McMahon was instrumental in having passed the Aged Persons Homes Act, which was a scheme allowing the Commonwealth to contribute on a pound-for-pound basis to the construction of homes for the elderly. And one of the things that McMahon did, which you can see on screen at the moment, is he publicised this scheme. He would go to a construction site with a cheque in hand and a photographer, and he would make sure that everybody there knew that it was the Menzies government handing this money over for this little bit of this home, this construction. And it was a tactic that annoyed his Labor parliamentarians to no end. They asked questions about it. They launched insults at him about it. They absolutely hated it. They really couldn't stand it. He also took on portfolios that he had little to no experience with, and yet he fast became adept with them. In 1956, when he was appointed Minister for Primary Industry, that is, the agriculture portfolio, McMahon joked to one colleague about his lack of experience. He said, "I have 2 pot plants on my balcony, and I know a little bit about it." I mean, there was kind of a gutsy courage, I suppose you could say, to that kind of remark. He was also, at this point, unafraid of angering his patrons. It's peculiar to say so, but McMahon, for his early ministerial career, was supported by and could count on as an ally John McEwen, the Country Party leader. Now, McMahon would come to feud with McEwen bitterly in years to come, but early in the 1950s, the two were allies. McEwen liked McMahon. He thought that he was energetic, that he was hardworking, and that he was a reliable kind of figure. That notwithstanding, McMahon was very happy to take the laurels that McEwen could give him, to take the support, but he was not afraid about taking him on. And when McMahon became Minister for Primary Industry and devised a scheme to reform the butter industry that would affect a key constituency of McEwen's as Country Party leader, McMahon persisted even though he knew it was going to annoy McEwen enormously. He only desisted when McEwen took him out of the cabinet room and said, "If you go on with this scheme, I will fucking murder you." At that point, advised by Menzies, McMahon decided to desist. But it is, I think, evidence here of McMahon being able to do things that other people later on might not have been able to perceive. He was hardworking, he was intelligent, he could read a room, he could talk to people, and he could see how politics could be influenced. So he was playing the game professionally, so to speak. In cabinet meetings, McMahon would often be one of the best prepared, and he would often show an ability to argue with prescience about a certain situation. I think one of the most notable examples of this comes in 1956 when the Suez Crisis erupted. McMahon was one of only 3 ministers at that time to argue against Robert Menzies' involvement in the negotiations with Egyptian President Nasser. In the early 1960s, McMahon was heavily involved to have government contribute aid to non-state schools. In 1964, at the vital Cabinet Committee meeting at which the decision was made to commit Australian military forces to Vietnam, McMahon was one of only 2 ministers, alongside Paul Hasluck, to argue against the idea. He said, "No, we shouldn't do this. The American strategy for Vietnam is unclear, and we should wait until that strategy is clear, so we know whether it will succeed or not, so we know what we're doing before we go in." In another vein, however, McMahon showed himself very early on to have some substantive philosophical political beliefs. In 1953, he gave a paper explaining and giving quite a bit of substance to his ideas about liberalism and about the practice of politics. His ideas are inflected by Christianity, and they are, to some extent, quite interesting. Even though they may read today as a bit of folderol, they are notable because they are rare among Liberal Party parliamentarians of his generation. Very few parliamentarians spoke about why they had certain beliefs and why the kind of philosophical, substantive thinkers that were influencing their ideas. The other point about it, I think, that is important is that McMahon even then made quite telling points about the role of pragmatism and flexibility in politics. What one Prime Minister might attempt, he said, might be quite beyond the wish or capacities of a successor. It's a telling little note that I think is probably worthwhile to keep in mind when we talk about McMahon's subsequent career. But of course, amongst this, even as he gave this paper, McMahon was arousing derision and dislike from his colleagues who could not stand his grandstanding and his condescension and his leaking and his backgrounding. Journalists also, the recipients of those leaks, couldn't believe it. They could barely stand the man. There's a famous story about McMahon leaking a news story to Graham Perkin, who was at that time working in Parliament House. McMahon actually leaked this to him while standing next to him at a urinal. Bit gross. But the next day, Menzies was laying into Perkins in King's Hall. McMahon saw it happening, and he wandered across and had enough hide to say to Menzies, "Gosh, I hope you're telling him off for that appalling piece of reporting. It was irresponsible journalism. It's not what you'd expect of a reporter from The Age." But it's the question that was asked by Herald journalist Angus McLaughlin that summed up the regard for McMahon in the small provincial pond that was Canberra in the 1950s. How can you respect a man like that? Many of McMahon's colleagues could not. Even as they acknowledged his propensity for hard work, they could not acknowledge or come to terms with his behaviour. The most notable example of McMahon's ability and willingness to use underhanded methods came in 1951, when he was promoted to the ministry, when he became Minister for Navy and Air. After the 1951 election, Menzies had announced that he was going to appoint another minister, that he was going to expand cabinet by one position, but that he would identify the new minister only once enabling legislation had been passed. That left a gap of about 2 months or so between the announcement that he wanted this new minister, and the identity of the new minister himself. And in that time, people got to work. Consensus rapidly had it that the new minister was going to be a man named Fred Osborne, a Sydney-based MP, a former lawyer who had served in the RAN during World War II. Quite a courageous man in many respects, and a laudable man too. The reason that the consensus had landed upon Osborne was that he was young, that he was a 49er, and that he was from New South Wales, where the Liberal Party was tremendously strong, and that strength needed to be reflected in the ministry. That was the argument. But when time came for the new minister to be announced, it wasn't Osborne, it was McMahon. Osborne, who had heard of this rumour and had reached out to have it confirmed by Menzies, and did have it confirmed by Menzies that he was to be the new minister, at this point heard of a deputation that had gone to see Liberal Party Deputy Leader Eric Harrison. 3 Liberal Party MPs had gone to Harrison and said that Osborne did not enjoy their confidence, that he was too arrogant, that he was a martinet, and they would not support him for this position in the ministry. Osborne only heard about this after the fact. He went to Harrison, he asked me if it was true, Harrison said it was. Osborne said, one question only then, was Billy McMahon a part of that deputation? Harrison looked down his nose and said yes. Now, what's interesting here, I think, in many respects, is that Osborne and McMahon had been friends beforehand. Obviously, they were both lawyers, they were both from Sydney, they were both 49ers, but they had been friendly, they had a rapport. McMahon, in fact, had actually given Osborne a lift to Canberra in his car after the 1949 election so that they could look around the House of Representatives chamber and see where they would be sitting. So it was kind of a blow to Osborne to hear that a friend and colleague didn't support him, had gone and done this in secret. And he felt humiliated by it. He felt that this experience, the betrayal of this, had left an irrevocable wound. And, you know, a journalist even at the time confirmed the underhandedness of this, came up to Osborne and said, look, it's not unusual in politics to have your throat cut. What is unusual and what is unforgivable is to be allowed to walk around for 3 weeks without knowing that your throat's been cut. And that's kind of, I think, a signal example of how McMahon operated. He was willing to go behind colleagues' backs. He was willing to denigrate. He was willing to manipulate to get ahead. And certainly with this appointment, he never ever saw any wrong with it. He in fact regarded the position as his, and that he said that he had called upon powerful allies to help him to get that position, to get what was rightfully his. It was actions like this that, of course, led colleagues to deride and dislike McMahon. Arthur Fadden called him Billy the Flea, and Menzies raked him over the coals repeatedly for his at times haphazard management of his portfolios. Perhaps most famously, Paul Hasluck, who would come to regard to McMahon as a tick and a contemptible creature. Hasluck saw McMahon in the most withering possible terms, and the remarks on screen at the moment are just a small taste of those. He saw a small, insecure man who wore platform shoes and suits with padded shoulders, and who was petty and vain and unable to perceive what other colleagues thought of him. And in some respects, I think it may be worth saying that Hasluck's regard for McMahon is so derisive that it's actually somewhat one-sided. There is an inability to recognise the other sides and the other qualities of McMahon, things that allowed him to succeed. His propensity for hard work, his ability to network, his ability to sell himself, and his willingness to do all that he could to get ahead. Some of the qualities of McMahon that McMahon had were not enviable or likeable, but they did help him get ahead. And Hasluck's inability to perceive those, I think, is notable. It is notable. What also is notable, though, is that McMahon was for many years regarded by his colleagues as a comic figure. The likeness, I think, is of Widmerpool from Anthony Power's Dance to the Music of Time. He's a comic guy. Nobody takes him very seriously. They see him just this small, bald, half-deaf, vain Sydney lawyer, this playboy playing in politics. But he keeps rising. He keeps getting ahead. And he becomes, over time, in this view, a darker and darker figure. And colleagues, of course, always wondered why it was that McMahon was never sacked. Why wasn't, amid all his leaking, why didn't he just get the boot? Why wasn't he thrown out on his ear? Late in the 1950s, Menzies, in fact, had managed to extract from McMahon a signed confession, which is on screen at the moment, that he had leaked from cabinet. And he supposedly kept it in a safe to be used if McMahon ever was caught leaking again, to sack him. But he never did. He never used it. He always kept it. McMahon was always able to move up, to consolidate his positions and to advance. From 1951 to 1953, he was Minister for Navy and Air. After 1954 elections, he became Minister for Social Security. In 1956, he became Minister for Primary Industry. In 1958, he became Minister for Labour and National Service. So he was gaining an enormous amount of experience in different portfolios. Also challenging portfolios, it should be said, in which he did not necessarily have much experience. The Labour and National Service portfolio in particular, though, was the place really where he won his spurs. As ever in the Liberal Party, he took on the waterfront by pursuing reform of the Australian Workers' Waterside Federation and playing it off against the ACTU to reduce hours lost to strikes and to reduce pension benefits. And he won, and that was enough to get him ahead in the Liberal Party. At the same time as he did this, though, McMahon was able to perceive that Robert Menzies wasn't going to be around for all that much longer, and that the Liberal Party hierarchy would soon be changing. And he jockeyed adroitly to get himself into position to rise in the Liberal Party leadership ranks. Sydney MP Bill Aston was approached by McMahon one day and asked if he would support him for the deputy leadership. Aston said yes, but on condition that he was given a ministry. Later on, Aston went to see McMahon's press secretary and told him news of this deal. "Would you tell him from me," Aston said, "that I'll cut his fucking balls off if he doesn't give me the position." So this is the kind of quid pro quo that McMahon was doing to get ahead. He was also enlisting support from vital press allies like Packer, like Alan Reid, and like the journalist Maxwell Newton. So it was deals like this, the support of allies like in the press, the support of various factions within the Liberal Party, and of course his much publicised marriage in 1965 to Sonia McMahon that allowed McMahon to surpass Paul Hasluck in 1966 and become deputy leader of the Liberal Party. He vaulted over Hasluck, won, and Hasluck could barely believe it. He was stunned. So McMahon became treasurer to Harold Holt, and at that point we have 5 tumultuous years in Australian politics. The most tumultuous and bitter, I think, that this country has probably known. The Holt government began to dismantle the White Australia policy, and it set about responding to the British decision to remove British forces east of the Suez. The Holt government escalated Australia's military involvement in Vietnam, won an election convincingly on that basis, and at the same time McMahon became locked in a bitter battle with Country Party leader John McEwen over tariff and protection for Australian industries. This is a point and an issue on which I think there is considerable historical scope. Debate over the tariff and debate over protection was a fault line in Australian politics that can be traced right back to Federation. McMahon was seeking to bring down protection. He wanted to reduce the pillar in the name of economic efficiency. McEwen was seeking to continue the long tradition of protection for Australian secondary industry, not in the least because these were his constituencies. So this is a big battle, and I think in some respects it is very much to McMahon's credit that he fought this battle where other people had squibbed it. But it's a battle that played out both in cabinet, in the press, and in the halls of Parliament House. It was often underhanded, it was always bitter, and it was always unrelenting. McMahon drew on journalists to help in his attacks on McEwen. He leaked Treasury material relentlessly, and McEwen in turn had staffers spying on McMahon and his staff. He accused McMahon of being involved in a lobby group that was attacking McEwen, and he accused McMahon regularly of duplicity. "You're a bloody liar, McMahon." That's what he said to him. Paranoia crept into all this. From fear that his phone was bugged, for example, McMahon actually started to use a telephone booth outside his unit. He thought that ASIO was listening in, that somebody was listening in on his telephone call, so he stopped using the phone in his house. And concern about the rift between McMahon and McEwen and the tension that it was creating, in fact, led to one of the most extraordinary interventions, I think, in ministerial politics in Australia. Richard Casey, the Governor-General, invited McMahon to Admiralty House for a, quote, long and hard talk with him. And afterward, he said, the little fellow just sat there and told me one barefaced lie after another when he knew I must have known the truth. So this is something I think that is kind of important, this big rift, this big battle between the two, because it is the ultimate prelude, of course, to the disappearance of Harold Holt. McEwen suddenly had the upper hand late in 1967. He prevailed upon Casey to swear him in as Prime Minister, and in that position he vetoed McMahon's candidature for the Prime Ministership and the Liberal Party leadership by saying that neither he nor his party would support McMahon should he be elected to the Liberal Party leadership. Then McEwen helped to swing support behind John Gorton, a Victorian senator at that point of only a few years' cabinet experience. Gorton, of course, became Prime Minister and ushered in his own ideas, his own policies, a new nationalism evident in decisions to protect Australian companies against foreign takeovers, an attempt to legislate for Commonwealth control of the continental shelf, and a decision, among others, to establish a film and television school. But there was antipathy all around. McMahon and McEwen still argued over the tariff and still argued over protection. And McMahon and Gorton were soon at loggerheads as well. They didn't like each other over economic policy, they didn't esteem each other or respect one another. McMahon and his allies agitated against Gorton relentlessly, leaking material, dropping rumours, to the point that in the lead up to the 1969 election, Robert Menzies, who was watching from afar, could write to his daughter to say that the little scamp, that is, McMahon, is on the warpath yet again. Again, another example of the kind of internecine warfare that was going on within the government. Ideas and speculation that McMahon was going to be sacked by Gorton should he win government again were rife at this point. McMahon even made no secret of it, and no secret that he thought it was likely to happen. He turned around and said to Bunga McCullum at one point, "Do you think the bastard would dare?" And in public, of course, this had the consequence of taking the government very close to death. When Gorton went to an election in 1969, the government was returned with a very substantial swing against it. And so he immediately faced a leadership challenge. McMahon stood against him, as did Minister David Fairbairn, Minister for National Development. Gorton won the challenge. He beat off McMahon, he beat off Fairbairn, and in the aftermath, he transferred McMahon from his beloved Treasury to the Ministry of External Affairs. McMahon was absolutely incensed by this. He told a prospective private secretary candidate that he wasn't interested in the job, that he didn't want the job, that he wanted somebody else to do it for him. Now, that regard for the External Affairs Ministry would change. McMahon would come to love it, and he would actually try to reform it by changing its name to the Department of Foreign Affairs, which prompted and amused Gorton to say, yes, Billy can have this. He will be the head of the Department of FA, the head of the Department of fuck all. But in 1971, in an affair that I suspect was very likely triggered by McMahon, Defence Minister Malcolm Fraser resigned from the Gorton ministry, savaged Gorton in the Parliament, and sparked a motion of confidence in Gorton's leadership that ultimately was tied. Gorton cast a negative vote and stepped down from the Liberal Party leadership and the Prime Ministership. Suddenly, almost unexpectedly, McMahon became Prime Minister. He had 20 years of experience behind him and about 20 months in which to use it before a new election was due. When he took office, of course, McMahon confronted a world in considerable flux. The certainties, I think, of earlier eras were at an end. The Keynesian consensus of the past 30 years on economics issues was giving way. The unquestioned alliance to the United States was now under question. National security was no longer quite the electoral plus that it had been for the government. Societal changes were in abundant evidence. Students were taking to the streets to protest the war in Vietnam. Germaine Greer was publicising the female eunuch. The censorship system was reeling and in tatters. The Greens movement was beginning in Tasmania. Neville Bonner was taking a seat in the federal parliament, the first Indigenous Australian to do so. And finally, the division and disunity, which had so long plagued and crippled the Labor Party, was now crippling the Liberal Party too. What we see in politics today, or what we saw under the Labor governments most recently, is but a repeat of that decade. There was considerable bitterness throughout McMahon's time in office over Gorton's deposal, and Gorton who remained deputy leader of the Liberal Party, was in some state of continued hostility and agitation. The two men would be sitting next to one another during cabinet meetings, and Gorton would sit there with his cigarette in his hand, passive-aggressively allowing the smoke to go into McMahon's face. McMahon waved it away, and eventually became so incensed at Gorton's presence in these meetings that he began starting them early, starting them late, and shuffling the agenda so as to dispose of more difficult items before Gorton arrived, because Gorton was all too happy to be a needle in McMahon's side. McMahon would make a declaration, and Gorton would just as easily say, well, that's got to be fucking stupid, doesn't it? There were concerns about McMahon rife throughout this time. The British High Commissioner to Australia, Maurice James, would write that McMahon was a small and shifty but dogged and resilient man whose Victorian appearance belies his gift for a contemporary brand of political slickness. He seems perennially surprised to find himself Prime Minister of such a solid and substantial country as Australia. Both his countrymen and, to an embarrassing extent, he himself know that he's not much good in the part. Now, I have to disagree with Morris on the lattermost claim here. I don't think that McMahon ever doubted his capacities for the Prime Ministership. One of the things that was notable while reading through McMahon's records and looking at papers around him is that McMahon expressed every confidence that he had always done well as Prime Minister. It's something that was recurring throughout his career. McMahon always sold himself as a terrific success, always portrayed himself as the most wonderful kind of politician and the most wonderful kind of man to hold office. He rarely conceded fault. He rarely admitted to misdeeds of his own. He always attributed failures and mistakes to colleagues, to enemies, to the conniving and scheming of opponents. He rarely ever conceded fault. And so I don't think that McMahon would ever have seen himself as being not much good in the part. One thing about McMahon that is really notable is that he always told these wonderful stories about himself, to the point that his colleague and admittedly an opponent, a Gorton supporter, in Jim Killen, would say that McMahon had Munchausen syndrome, that he was so prone to telling these fantastical stories about himself that he just couldn't, keep it tethered to reality. And the gap between the stories that McMahon told and the reality and experience of so many colleagues was such that people began to speculate in later years about whether McMahon was in some kind of cognitive decline, whether he was in some kind of madness. It's been openly canvassed in quite a few places. But I'm rather of the belief that McMahon simply had told stories about himself so often, told so many stories about his talents and his skills and his abilities, that he came to believe them to the point that he just would not hear or understand the experiences and the regard that others had for him. As Mungo McCullum said, he was just not a not very bright politician who had gone well past the Peter principle and was scrabbling for any kind of purchase he could possibly hold. The scrabbling, of course, was due in no small part because of the problems that plagued his government. Although Gorton had resigned as deputy leader of the Liberal Party and as Minister for Defence in August 1971, the bitterness and the discontent over his fall bubbled on, and the disenchantment with McMahon arose almost immediately. Early in 1972, one Liberal Party MP, Bert Kelly, wrote of McMahon, "How do we get rid of him? I suppose the only hope that we have is that he suddenly drops dead one day." Late in 1972, a group of ministers who were drinking one evening in the cabinet room canvassed putting Doug Anthony, the Country Party leader by this stage, into the top job, with McMahon retiring with what they called, quote, a diplomatic illness. Rupert Murdoch apparently encouraged Billy Snedden to challenge McMahon and promised support from the press if he did so, right up until the end of 1972, when the House was dissolved for the 1972 election. There were constant rumours and whispers about unseating McMahon. In world affairs, of course, there was tension between means and ends, between what was possible and what, in the Yes Minister terms, might be deemed courageous. The People's Republic of China was emerging from a long self-imposed exile and beginning to re-engage with the world. McMahon was aware, all too aware, from his time as Minister for Foreign Affairs, that the relationship with China needed to be reevaluated, but he was at the same time very cautious as to be seen not to get too far ahead of the United States, and also to not antagonize the Democratic Labour Party, which was vociferously anti-communist and vociferously anti-China. In his efforts to satisfy these, to meet all of these different kind of aims and opportunities, McMahon left an opening for the Labour Party under Gough Whitlam to exploit. When Whitlam visited China in June 1971, McMahon sought to play politics. He castigated Whitlam for betraying Australia's interests, only to find himself backtracking and flailing when he found out that the United States had, at nearly the same time, sent Henry Kissinger to meet with the Chinese leadership. He complained publicly about the Americans and their secrecy. He criticised Richard Nixon by suggesting he would lose re-election. He sacked his own foreign minister, Les Bury. He blamed his own staff, and he told colleagues that China was a failure of his prime ministership, but not one that was his failure, that it was a failure, and that it was caused by other people. That word, though, failure, was becoming something of a catch-all. The head of McMahon's Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet was saying that every day was a crisis. McMahon had moved to withdraw Australian combat troops from Vietnam and had all Australian combat troops home by December 1971, but he got little credit for this from his colleagues and from the public, particularly as there was debate over conscription and draft dodgers, and the moratorium marches continued. Battles with the Country Party, meanwhile, undermined any pretense toward unity within the government. At one point, during a battle over the terms of currency, the coalition, in fact, actually almost split apart. McMahon told colleagues, Christ, we're in a terrible bloody mess. The coalition can be gone. What can I do? If I give in to Doug Anthony, I'm gone. Finished. If I don't, we split. They didn't split, of course, but this is kind of, I think, a signal of just how dire the government's standing was. A tough budget in 1971 to 72 didn't win any friends or admirers, and a more generous budget in the following year won also no admirers. It was thought to be just a craven cash handout ahead of an election. Even visits to the United States and UK late in 1971 would turn sour. President Richard Nixon, of whom McMahon continued to talk volubly about how wonderful he was, would forget how to pronounce McMahon's name and would rebuff his pleas for reassurance by invoking the importance of the ANZUS Treaty. McMahon's visit, in fact, I think, becomes defined by an over-revealing dress and a toast that mangled Shakespeare. One listening journalist overheard muttered, "I wish I was Italian." McMahon was inducing shame among the travelling press corps. That's how kind of dire, how bad his image was. The thing is that amid the growing economic problems and amid the disunity and distrust among his government, McMahon seemed to reap what he sowed. He turned on his colleagues and staff. He refused to delegate. He always inserted himself in portfolios and meddled. He manipulated and he backgrounded. And I think in doing so, he began to show the gap between the public image of a competent minister who could handle a brief and who could do good work, and the private reality, a minister who was reliant on the public service, a minister who was asking others to cover for him. One, I think, very good example of this is the McMahon penchant for altering Hansard's, the records of parliamentary debate. McMahon had done this for many years. When asked a question in the House, he would get up and, as though he had the statistics and the numbers just at his fingertips, would reel off figures like nothing else, just kind of played the place like nothing else. But he actually had those figures wrong. His staff would alter, with the correct figures, the Hansards when they were delivered to his office for checking. Nobody noticed it for a very long time. It was only when a Labour MP pointed it out in late in 1971, that it was discovered. McMahon blamed his chief of staff and his press secretary for this. When they pointed out that if he continued to do so, he would draw attention to it, he told them both to shut up. He didn't like people complaining about him. He didn't like feedback on his performances. Why don't you stop criticising me? You're always nitpicking. That's the kind of thing he would ask his staffers. Colleagues became exasperated by it. They couldn't believe how much support, how much protection it seemed McMahon actually needed. "God protect me from my friends," Alan Reid wrote after McMahon mishandled a debate in the House of Representatives, "and keep me aware that reality is not what you want it, but what it is." At times, McMahon's staff would look through the peephole into the Prime Minister's office and see McMahon sitting, back against the chair, pale, white-knuckled hands gripping the arms of his chair, looking for signs and portents of opening, of some opportunity where he could regain the initiative. His chief of staff said he was in survival mode. It was in that vein that McMahon was mercurial, prone to shifting with the breeze. On Indigenous land rights, which had arisen late in 1971, McMahon variously supported establishing a traditional association with the land as a basis for land rights claims, then backtracked, then reversed course again, then reversed course yet again. When he announced on January 26, 1972, that his government would not legislate to have a basis for traditional association with the land as basis for land rights claims, he explained that he could not do so because the government could not foresee the consequences. The next morning, 4 Aboriginal activists were on the lawns outside Parliament House holding umbrellas and picnic rugs and signs that said Aboriginal 10th Embassy. They're still there today. McMahon blundered and he stumbled. He baffled and he infuriated. What is wrong with him? Asked one Liberal MP. I'll be loyal to him because he is the leader, said another. But Christ, he must be mad. Journalists became infuriated with McMahon. For God's sake, Alan Reid told him, behave like a Prime Minister. McMahon blamed the Treasury and his successor at Treasury, Billy Snedden, for continued economic woes. He heaped blame on Sir John Bunting for all the work that he was having to carry. He told Bunting at one point that he would crack up if he went on with the work at the present rate. He lashed out at his staff and he blamed them for problems. He was despairing of the press and its turn to more critical coverage. At a time when writers like Munga McCullum and Bob Ellis, and cartoonists like Michael Leunig and Bruce Petty were kind of coming to prominence and experimenting with new forms of very subjective journalism, McMahon became incensed. He couldn't handle it, disliked it. The growing prominence of TV also compounded McMahon's public image problems. In his younger years as a minister, McMahon had actually been very well evaluated and very well regarded for TV. He actually took part in election debates on 2 occasions, at a time when he was still a very junior minister. But as Prime Minister, McMahon seemed wooden and stilted. Eric Pearce, who was a newsreader for Channel GTV9 down in Melbourne, came to try and help McMahon and enliven his manner. But he left after a few fruitless sessions saying, he's fucked. Another point, staff tried to kind of help McMahon stop sweating, so they caked his face with amputee stump powder, only to find that it gave him this kind of ghastly, pale pallor, as though he was recently embalmed. This was the kind of thing that kind of really hampered McMahon. His public image became just horribly comedic, became one of a man who was inept, who was paddling furiously to stay afloat, and he could never get by. The folk singer Eric Bogle, I think, gives a really good example of just how bad it was. Just McMahon is this poor little fella who looks, he dresses well, but he's pathetic, really. A kind of pitiable kind of figure. And at a time when the press was increasingly focused, I think, on presidential politics, when it was focused on the leadership, this was very much to McMahon's disfavour. The contrast with Gough Whitlam, was enormous. Whitlam is tall, McMahon is short. Whitlam has a full head of hair, McMahon is bald. Whitlam has a kind of sure voice. McMahon's, however, is faint, thanks to his deafness. He seems abuzz and flighty, where Whitlam seems deliberate. He seems old, where Whitlam seems young and energetic. And where Whitlam speaks of a promising future and change, McMahon could not help but appear like a figure of the past. The funny thing about all of this, though, is that McMahon, even as all this was happening, was amassing quite a substantial record within the Parliament. The legislative achievements of the McMahon government are actually quite significant, and I think in some respects have been underplayed by many historians and writers since. It's kind of not particularly well understood just how much legislation was passed. Now, certainly some of it was opportunistic, some of it was reactionary, and some of it was panicked. But the McMahon record, when you look at it, is actually quite substantial. The McMahon government, for example, passed the Childcare Act, which allowed the Commonwealth government to give, which provided grants for the childcare sector, transforming it into a profession that was supported by research and by funds. His government adopted the polluter pays principle for environmental protection. his government established the National Urban and Regional Development Authority. It instituted an inquiry into poverty. It passed the Foreign Takeovers Bill to prevent foreign takeovers of Australian companies. It expanded spending in education, independent schools, universities, and TAFEs. And under McMahon, Australia entered into the Five Powers Defence Arrangement. It accelerated independence from Papua New Guinea, and Australia joined the OECD under McMahon. I think it is a substantive record. And some small signal of how this kind of came to be portrayed was offered by Donald Horne, who said that the period immediately before Whitlam might seem on first glance to be something of an interregnum, shapeless, even silly period in Australian history. But rather, he said, these were the years of critical change at a social, at a political level. In terms of objective results, Horne went on to say, McMahon had modernised the political agenda and given voice to changes underway already in Australian society. McMahon went to the election against Labor in December 1972, and in ways that might be seen as tragic, if also faintly comic, he found that the planks that had supported Liberal Party re-election campaigns of the past had suddenly gone rotten. State aid to private schools was no longer a winner for the Liberal Party. Labor matched them on it. The support of the business community was no longer assured. The spectre of communism, the surety and reassurance of national security all had given way. Vital allies were deserting McMahon and the Liberal Party. Frank Packer sold his interest in the Daily Telegraph to Rupert Murdoch, and Murdoch went all out for Labor in 1972. Nugget Coombs, whom McMahon had called his guiding philosopher and had once hit in the face with a squash racket, seemed to support Labor, and even McMahon's own ministers actually canvassed and talked about life after McMahon, that is, a post-McMahon political life. McMahon went on television and retaliated, saying, in fact, how little his ministers had done, how much he had to do himself, and how disappointed he had been in their abilities. One journalist who listened to this said, well, he's fucked himself now. And he had. Few had any hope that McMahon would win the election, though McMahon himself certainly expressed every confidence that he would. As he told the editor of The Age, Graham Perkin, the man to whom he had once leaked, the funny little man has convinced himself that he is a brilliant success and sees himself winning handsomely, and then in 3 years, leading them to victory in 1975 and retiring with honours thick upon him. God save us all. Whitlam emerged from the 1972 election victorious, and with a 9-seat majority. It's often been recounted and said that this election was a landslide victory, but it wasn't. Labor won government by 9 seats. 2,000 votes, spread just right across 5 seats, would actually have seen the coalition retain office. And in my view, the view of McMahon's government would be very, very different. Its time would certainly have gone down in Australian political history as one of the most arrogant slogans to have ever been created and used by a major political party. One of the consequences of the McMahon government loss in 1972, though, is that the small achievements of the McMahon government, that legislative record that I recounted just now, were somewhat built over. They became part of the Whitlam government. They became lost and overshadowed by the Whitlam government and its record in office. McMahon's time as Prime Minister, in effect, was consigned to the dark. McMahon was, of course, always conscious that this was happening, and he was always conscious of his legacy and the need to protect it. He stayed in Parliament for another 10 years after his election loss, hoping for recall to the front lines of politics. But when that finally seemed not to happen, he decided to give it away. He retired and set himself for the next 6 years to writing an autobiography that he believed would vindicate his reputation and vindicate his record in office. As he saw it, McMahon had a good story to tell, and he told journalists that when they read of his book, they would not be able to believe the kinds of things he had had to put up with. Over the 6 years that between 1982 and 1988, McMahon employed a legion of ghostwriters to try and write the book that he hoped would vindicate that record. The papers that he had amassed throughout his career, a selection of which is glimpsed on the screen, show exactly how much documentation he had to support him. His faith in the correctness of his actions, of his record and his conduct in office, and his fervent wish that that record would be known, however, prevented that book from ever being completed. It was the difference between his record and the record as understood by others that stopped this. On another occasion, for example, during which McMahon's staff has wrestled with the problem of McMahon's record of the truth and what was actually the truth, they wrote, "What avails to William's sense and what the cultured word against the undoctored incident that actually occurred." It's a signal example of the difference between the private McMahon and his view of what had happened and the public reality and the public understanding. McMahon died in 1988, the autobiography unpublished, and in the years since, the derision of colleagues and the mythos around the Whitlam government, I think, have overshadowed McMahon and overshadowed his time in office. Not that McMahon's own story, as he saw it, would ever have done much to correct it. He was, I think, so far removed from a true understanding, unable to see his story and understand it properly, and understand it and present it in a way that would have been compelling and credible to make a difference to that view of his record. McMahon didn't, I think, attract acolytes. He had only apostates. But what I tried to do in my book about McMahon is to get at what actually occurred, as best as possible, to get at the truth of the record, to look at McMahon anew, and at the same time to follow that second track, to look at McMahon and see beyond him a chronicle of Australian politics, and to look at him and see a landscape of Australian culture and change, and how that played out while he was in office. That's a small taste of what I hoped to present today. Thank you very much.
And Patrick, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. Covers a lot of ground, of course, that you cover in the book, which is a fantastic read for anybody who either is unfamiliar with Billy McMahon's life or is old enough to remember it, but not remember it terribly clearly. I remember the period of his prime ministership and immediately afterwards an extremely tumultuous time. And yes, that sense that one had about the ALP, having a landslide victory is certainly pretty much cemented in my recollections of the time. Now, we have some questions here. So Ward O'Neill, who I happen to know is a former newspaper caricaturist, says, as a beneficiary of Billy McMahon's political career and the period of his prime ministership, I'd like to ask if it's possible to measure the impact of cartoons on public perceptions of McMahon.
I don't know how easy it is to measure it and kind of quantify it, but I think certainly it fed into that image of McMahon as someone who was dithering and incompetent and not equal to the demands of his office. All of the cartoons that were produced by people like Bruce Petty, like Larry Pickering, that they all portray him and show him as this kind of shrub, this weed with the big Volkswagen ears, famously the ears as big as a Volkswagen with its doors open. So I don't think they ever helped him. But certainly it's worth saying at the same time, that kind of subjective journalism I mentioned fed into that. Having these cartoons did expose McMahon to some ridicule, and it's certainly of a different kind of ridicule to that which was, say, visited on Robert Menzies. It's unthinkable to think of Menzies having the same kind of cartoons done about him that were done about McMahon.
Whose drawing did we? Oh, sorry.
The drawing at the start was a sketch done of McMahon by Paul Hasluck in a cabinet meeting.
Oh, really? Oh, right. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Now, Peter Robinson has a comment. He says he recalls Professor Patrick Collinson at Sydney University in History 1A in late 1971, holding up the afternoon paper announcing McMahon PM at the start of our evening lecture. Peter must be about my vintage. And then he adds, ironically, the other newspaper political change announcement I remember from a newspaper via a street billboard in George Street from my last year at Sydney Uni was Gough sacked. We all remember that pretty vividly also. Kate O'Neill says, so McMahon was a manipulator. He was adept at media. He was a fast learner. Would he do well in today's political world?
Absolutely. I think his talents were uniquely suited both to his period, and certainly they were in advance of his period. But I think he would be a very, very capable, cunning politician today. The politicians today use the same kind of things, use the same tactics that McMahon did, going around and presenting checks with photo opportunities and making sure everyone knows exactly who's giving the money. McMahon pioneered that, and I'm sure that he would be able to do that again today. Using social media, that might be a bit more difficult, but I think he would certainly get ahead. I think he'd certainly be very good at it. Yeah.
Now we have someone whose name I'm not quite sure what that reads as. This person says, Gorton gave the green light to Australia building its own nuclear weapons. McMahon killed the plan. What was McMahon's attitude to nuclear weapons and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Great question. That's a really, really interesting one. Australia for many years was determined to get nuclear weapons. And John Gorton was absolutely fervent about getting nuclear weapons for Australia. He greenlit the construction of the Jervis Bay nuclear power reactor. That was a project that was scrapped by McMahon when he became Prime Minister, allegedly out of financial concerns about the project and its viability. But and I found this actually quite notable, was that one of the earliest things that McMahon did as Foreign Minister was actually overcome Gorton's attempts to put off signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. McMahon became Foreign Minister late in 1969, and early in 1970, the push was on to have Australia sign the thing, to not sign the thing. The window was closing, the treaty was going to come into force, and McMahon actually managed to lobby and cajole his colleagues to overcome Gorton's opposition. He had Australia sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's worth saying that his attitude on nuclear weapons isn't exactly clearly stated. His concern about signing the treaty was to ensure that Australia was not diplomatically isolated. There were some fears that Australia might be locked out of certain weapons arrangements, or that the United States might take a dim view of its unwillingness to sign and stem the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So that kind of was McMahon's motivation. But he was certainly instrumental in killing off the Australian nuclear program. That is, I think, a significant legacy, for better or worse, depending on what your nuclear power is. Yeah.
I think we're all pretty grateful that Jervis Bay was saved from that fate. Any of us who visit there, as many people in Canberra do, and Sydney. Peter Robinson asks, have you been able to analyse the dynamics of political parties towards the end of a long period in power, especially after a very long incumbency by a founding or seminal leader such as a Menzies?
I haven't been able to.
A large question.
Yeah. Come back to me in like maybe 10 or 15 years when I've got a few more projects under my belt, and I can give that answer. One thing I think that's worth saying about the Liberal Party and Menzies' heirs, so to speak, is that they were, I think, in many ways, by the end, the second 11. Harold Holt had long cabinet experience and was, in some ways, a worthy successor. But it's worth saying that the kinds of problems that were presented late in the 1960s and early 1970s, and which bedeviled people like Holt and Gorton and McMahon, are ones I think that Menzies probably would have been able to handle a bit better. Gorton in particular is one who I think was a very poor heir for Menzies. He had a very limited cabinet experience, and the kind of cabinet experience he had would have shown him a prime minister who was, solely and wholly in command. Menzies, by the end of his prime ministership, was just the undisputed giant within the Liberal Party. You didn't question him. Earlier on, though, in his tenure, even in his second tenure as prime minister, he was regularly criticised, and there were a lot of cabinet meetings where colleagues took him on because they knew him as an equal. That wasn't the case by the end. So Gorton, coming in the mid-1960s and seeing Menzies in his heyday in the kind of the grand old man of Australian politics, saw a kind of authoritarian, very executive kind of style prime ministership that he tried to himself perform as prime minister. But the fractious divides and disunity among the Liberal Party meant that Gorton was never going to be able to exert the same kind of control and power that Menzies had had. McMahon obviously had a much longer cabinet experience and was well aware of how to tango with Menzies. But he himself, as I said in the talk, he reaped what he had sowed. The kind of division and disunity that he had undermined his colleagues and undermined leaders. His colleagues were not exactly going to kind of turn around and suddenly rally around him as the most inspiring man of Australian politics. So, there's some talk that Menzies winnowed the Liberal Party to remove challenges. I don't agree with that. But I think the attrition within the Liberal Party was that they elevated men who were not particularly well suited to the office that they came to hold.
Thanks. Now, Ward O'Neill says McMahon's opposition to military deployments, instancing Sinai and Vietnam, was unusual for Conservative politicians at the time. What do you think lay behind McMahon's stance on these issues?
I think to some extent scepticism about foreign affairs, and to some extent as well naivety about them. With reference to Suez and military deployments there. So when you say Sinai, do you mean the Arab-Israeli conflicts? Is that what?
I guess that's what he's alluding to.
Okay, I'm not too sure about that one actually. I think in the main, McMahon had some prescience about, with Vietnam at least, had some prescience about what was going on, and could see for himself that the strategy there was not particularly clear. He was also, for quite a while in his ministerial career, quite sceptical about the American alliance. One of his staffers, Peter Kelly, told me of a conversation with McMahon where he asked him if Australia was ever invaded, would the United States come to Australia's defence? And McMahon amazed Kelly by sitting back in his chair and thinking about the question for about 5 minutes, and eventually answering no. And this question was at a time when Australia was prosecuting its involvement in Vietnam by saying, we need to support the Americans here because if they will support us if we ever have a problem as well. So, even as he went out horse and foot to argue that line, McMahon privately was sceptical about it. But it's worth saying by the time he became Prime Minister, he was intent on making as much out of the alliance with America as possible, and using it for political and electoral gain.
Now, someone from the Blackheath History Forum, I'm not quite sure who that is, asks, which political biography would you like to tackle next? Do you have a plan?
I do. I'm tossing up between a couple at the moment. I think a biography of John McEwen, a really in-depth biography of McEwen, is worth some time. But as anybody who's done a project like this knows, they take so much energy and they take so much of your life that you really need to be invested. And so I'm just kind of still gauging whether I'm that interested in blackjack.
And Catherine Bishop is asking a question on behalf of Richard White. She says, great talk, Patrick, or perhaps that's Richard saying it. But why did you choose to do McMahon? Yes, I know that's a question you are most often asked, but it's an important question.
It is absolutely. I chose to do Billy McMahon because I decided I wanted to do a political biography. In 2014, I finished writing a PhD on political biography at the University of Canberra, but I had not actually written a biography during that PhD. I just kind of made a study of the genre. So I was interested to test out myself and see what I could do with it. And so I looked around for a suitable subject. And McMahon just kind of struck me immediately as the most obvious choice. He was a prime minister, so he's a giant in the field. So, big test of what I could do. But he was also something of a person of whom, the field was wide open. Nobody else had written a book about him, and nobody seemed to be in the frame to do one. There was also kind of a happy medium in the sense that some people were still alive and so willing to talk. But also so much of the cabinet documents and archival material was now available. Cabinet notebooks, for example, they're an immensely useful and wonderful resource, and I could draw on them. But 10, 15 years ago, I would not have been able to do so. So I was really quite happy to do McMahon. He seemed the perfect subject for that. And as time went on, as I kept working, that line about McMahon's life being a way to explore an enormous path of Australian history just seemed to grow and grow. His life digressed into so many different areas that I felt this is the guy, this is a wonderful way to come at and understand a long period of Australian politics.
And I guess you could say, I mean, after reading your book, I would certainly say that he, really is a neglected figure in that sense. So well worth the attention. Kath's wondering if he was an Anglophile.
I never got a sense of a particular interest or fervour for all things England. Certainly he was no Menzies in the sense of that kind of love and adulation for England and regarding the UK as being the glowing centre of the world. I'm not too sure, though, that McMahon was ever that interested. Sorry, that's my dog just barking there.
We know.
I'm not too sure that he was ever interested in political affairs, in foreign affairs, until he became foreign minister. After that, he was a bit more, but not really much scope to kind of that question. Sorry.
I have a question about one of the things I found very interesting in the book was the way you interspersed your chapters with commentary by David Bowman, very senior journalist who'd been hired to, I think, edit being the operative word, McMahon's autobiography. And he very obviously kept a diary about that process. I'm assuming the diary is still in private hands. It's not in a public record somewhere. Is that correct?
It's sitting in a storage closet in my house.
Right. So does that mean that you've had more or less exclusive access to it, or have other people used it as well in their work?
Unless David has lent it out before me, it's solely me, exclusive access to it. Yeah.
Anyway, it made well, as with any long work of non-fiction, it's nice to have, a bit of a breakup between chapters where there's a change of pace and a change of voice, really. I mean, you're writing it, but David Bowman's voice comes through loud and clear. So I just wonder if you could comment on that a bit, on the process of using those diaries and what they showed you about McMahon.
Yeah. So one of the things I began to do when I was looking at McMahon, I mean, one of the kind of points that did interest me about him was that he had written an autobiography but never been able to publish it. Back when I was first researching McMahon, Melbourne University Press was kind of seeming to publish any autobiography by any politician, whether they had a pulse or not. So it seemed to me to be very bizarre that McMahon would be unable to write and publish his autobiography. So I set about tracking down some of his ghostwriters, and I spoke to a couple of people and managed to get in touch with David, who gave me this diary. And as soon as I began reading the diary, I thought I had to use it in the way I was going to, by interspersing it. So on one hand, having a conventional political biography narrative, but at the same time, intertwining it with these diary entries describing McMahon trying to write his autobiography and Bowman trying to edit it. The thing about that structure, I mean, the structure itself owes something, I think, to Gore Vidal's novel about Aaron Burr, where Burr commissions a journalist to write his memoirs. But it gave me a way to kind of come at some of the gaps in the record. McMahon told all these wonderful stories about himself, and he amassed this enormous archive, and ostensibly that archive was going to be very reliable. But of course it was not. McMahon was editing and rewriting material within that archive. And you then, of course, had another archive of other colleagues and government records and so on, official records of what had happened. So there was a kind of way that I could see that by using Bowman's diary, I could explore the gaps in the record about McMahon, and I could explore the gaps where his colleagues had said one thing and McMahon had said another. And kind of show that whenever you're writing biography, whenever we're writing history, we're reconstructing something, and there are always gaps and silences. There are always things that are lost, and there are some things that might be recovered, and that there are different ways too of understanding the past and interpreting it. And McMahon is kind of par example of that. He was constantly rewriting and constantly seeing himself as this wonderful, wonderful figure, when his colleagues would say very different things. The diaries themselves, they're loose leaf, sometimes they're handwritten, Sometimes they're typed, but they are immensely vivid. Bowman, as a journalist, was very alive to telling details and to small illuminating moments, and he recorded stuff just wonderfully well. And the papers that he entrusted to me contain among them an enormous number of memos and drafts and documents that gave me kind of access to something of McMahon's private papers, even though I didn't have official access. The McMahon papers themselves constitute one of the largest collections of papers in the National Library of Australia, but the control of access to them is solely the preserve of the McMahon family, and they did not cooperate with my book. They did not want to talk to me, and they did not give me access. So that diary and those papers gave me an opportunity to come at McMahon in a way that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to.
It's very revealing because he was in the last years of his life, I suppose, where possibly what you might term character flaws become more exaggerated and more problematic for other people. And there were how many filing cabinets of personal papers was David Bowman? How many? 20 filing cabinets. Yeah, it's rather a lot. And the interpersonal relationships within that office, when various other people were also assisting with supposedly editing the autobiography and secretarial assistants and so on, and how that played out and what people there were saying behind the scenes about McMahon and what he was insisting on. And it was quite illuminating, I suppose, about a man who was aware that he was in decline, was how I read it. Oh dear. We've lost Patrick here. I'm not sure what to do. Are you back?
Sorry, I'm
here
back.
We are.
The dog jumped on the screen. I'm really sorry.
That's perfectly all right. I guessed, I thought it might be the dog. Yeah, anyway. Now, Catherine, also a question for Richard. Richard must have lost his voice somewhere. Says Gorton was seen as shifting to a more nationalist position. How did McMahon react to that, and how far did he push a consciously nationalist perspective the way Whitlam would?
That's a really good question. McMahon, one of the things that Gorton, with this kind of very nationalist view and policies, is that McMahon saw these as often kind of an antagonistic, saw them as kind of an affront to Liberal Party values. Gorton's moves to legislate for Commonwealth control of the continental shelf, for example, was seen by McMahon, to antagonise the Liberal Party state premiers and arouse their opposition. McMahon didn't really kind of, he saw it as kind of a political problem more than a policy one. So he wanted to pull that back, calm the premiers down. And I don't think, in some respects, that there was a strong ideological opposition to Gorton's nationalism. I think it was more so one of politics. He was kind of, I think, just trying to oppose Gorton right often and over again. I don't see McMahon really as a conscious nationalist in some ways. I see him as somebody who was kind of almost making things up as they went along, but trying to work things out at a time when the world was in flux. His relationship with the United States is a very good example of that. His unwillingness to have Australia declare its own position, but rather to wait for a lead from the United States is I think, a kind of example of how McMahon was all too aware of what other people would do and their influence on Australian events. So his attempts to introduce a differentiation in cultural recognition versus diplomatic recognition of the PRC, for example, and his vacillation over how much Australia should engage with Britain via the Five Powers defence arrangements. I don't see him as a nationalist in that same kind of way that Gorton unabashedly was. I see him more so somewhat making it up, an opportunist.
Just back to two things, two people I'd like to talk about, and we might sort of start to wind up there, but I was interested in his relationship with Alan Reid, who of course was a huge figure in the Canberra Press Gallery over a very, very long period of time. Very, very influential. And it was interesting how the way you painted the connections between Maxwell Newton and then Packer and Reid, and Reid's really active almost interference in the process of who he promoted and who he didn't, and at whose behest and at whose bidding. And after that, perhaps we could talk a little bit about Sonia McMahon. So if we talk first about Alan Reid.
The relationship with Alan Reid is a very interesting one. Reid is, I think, a very good example of somebody who got too close to the action. He always likened Parliament to the zoo and said that, you want to look at the animals, but you don't put your hand in the cage. Reid definitely put his hand in the cage. He was, all too willing to involve himself in events, to leak news to different people, to be the recipient of leaks. And it's worth saying he was quite a stellar journalist in many ways. The 12 Faceless Men of Labour owes its genesis to Reid. But McMahon's relationship with him was close, and I think it was mutually supportive. McMahon is famously alleged to have leaked news that Australia was committing its military forces to Vietnam, for example, which was a story that was broken by Alan Reid. But I think some measure of the relationship between them can also be seen in a comparison between between Alan Reid's public coverage of McMahon, his reportage of the McMahon government, and a diary that he kept at the same time. That diary contains comments that are just remarkably candid and remarkably frank and very, very critical of McMahon. Of Reid recounting ministers rolling their eyes at McMahon, of Reid kind of just scornful of McMahon's talk. But in his public reportage, Reid at times he either says McMahon is wonderful, competent, steady as she goes, or he turns his guns on the Labor Party and is very heavily critical of them. So it's a really interesting relationship that they have. And I think it is worth saying that there was a personal aspect to it. McMahon went to Alan Reid's, I think his daughter's wedding. There's a photo of it that's reproduced in the Ross Fitzgerald-Stephen biography of Reid. So there was a close personal association and definitely a professional one that was mutually supportive. Yeah.
And Sonia, we saw the photograph of her in the famous dress, which has ensured she's imprinted on everybody's memory from that time. But your portrait of her is fairly sympathetic, and I found it quite interesting because I know her only really as his wife, and the question marks over his bachelorhood, for want of a better word. He was getting pretty old by the time he married her, and then as his wife, but then also later she was a kind of a centre of the social scene in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, a wealthy socialite, I suppose you'd describe her as. So tell us what your feelings are about Sonia.
I think Sonia, in many respects, is a more substantial figure than she has been given kind of credit for. One thing I was quite surprised about, I mentioned at the start of the talk that McMahon had this insecurity and anxiety about his position and about power and kind of adulation from voters, the Phaeton complex that I talked about that resulted from his parents' bereavement. I think, though, that McMahon's marriage to Sonia helped to steady that. He had with her famously 3 children, one of whom was born, in fact, when McMahon was Prime Minister. But there's countless anecdotes of Sonia actually providing him with considerable amount of support of her. For example, there's a story where McMahon, after criticising his ministers during the 1972 election campaign and realising just how badly that had backfired, realising that he was basically painting everyone around him as a traitor, that he sat in the seat on the plane kind of dejected and, just, I suppose, forlorn. And she knelt in the aisle beside him and held his hand and refused to go to her seat for the plane to take off. She said, I'm just going to stay here. I'm just going to hold his hand. So there was a loving relationship. And I think he was able to find a centre, a kind of place where he didn't have to be fearful or be anxious or be insecure. So I think in some respects, Sonia, in being able to afford him that space, did actually have more substance, and shows that their marriage was quite a solid one. The rumours around McMahon's homosexuality, or he was poof, so to speak, were rife right throughout his career until he was married, and even persisted afterward. Whitlam, in fact, made a jibe about that during the 72 campaign by saying that it takes some people a long time to have an interest in women. But I think that McMahon's marriage with Sonia was real, fast as it was, unusual as it was in the age difference. But I think it did steady him, and I think it did help him a bit as well. So Sonia, I think, deserves some kind of, acknowledgement for that role.
And you did certainly always get the impression that she was just very loyal to him, emotionally loyal. I can see your voices are starting to give out. I thought what we might do is just quickly talk about your other book, which is out now. So this one, Tiberius of the Telephone, is readily available in all good bookshops, including Glee Books in Blackheath, but has now also been produced in paperback form, which is great because it's same book but significantly less expensive. And your new published book is called?
The Trials of Portnoy.
Right. So that, Jim, want to just give us a little plug for it? Tell us about it.
Sure. So in 1970, Penguin Books Australia decided to publish Portnoy's Complaint, which was the third novel by Philip Roth, an American writer. And they did it in order to bring down the Australian censorship system. Portnoy's Complaint was banned, and Penguin put this book out. They printed 75,000 copies. They sent them all around the country. And in doing so, they brought on 9 criminal trials against them and other booksellers around Australia that went on between 1970 and 1973. They helped to bring down the censorship system that had marked Australian literary and film. And in doing so, I think they helped to reshape Australian culture. My book is an account of the demise of the censorship system and an account of the trials, which of course cut across a huge swathe of Australia's cultural and literary elite.
Well, I think that's another great subject. So thank you very much for talking to all of us today at length. You could thank your little dog for his or her entertaining participation. And I just have a little bit of housekeeping to do here. I want to thank Kate O'Neill, who is a Blue Mountains historian and is chair of the Woodford Academy Management Committee. This is her coming on screen now. She is currently completing a master's degree in museum heritage at Sydney University. So she coordinates all of our social media with Emily O'Gorman, and today she has managed all the technical side for us for this YouTube presentation, and we could not do it without her. So thank you very much, Kate. And next time, our last online talk for this year's Blackheath History Forum season. So people who normally come to our in-person events will be aware we have a presentation by a distinguished historian every year, which is called the V. Gordon Child Memorial Lecture. Child was one of Australia's most acclaimed historians, widely credited with being the founder of the discipline of prehistory. He had a close association with the Blue Mountains, and actually he died in Blackheath. He was the author of several famous works and believed, as we do, in the importance of historians engaging with the general public on the relevance and meaning of their work for the wider community. That, in general, you could say is part of the philosophy of the Blackheath History Forum. So we will have eminent historian Terry Irving joining us to discuss his recent widely praised biography of Child, which is long overdue, I think, a proper biography of V. Gordon Child. It's titled The Fatal Lure of Politics, The Life and Thought of V. Gordon Child. So please, everyone, join us again on the 14th of November at 4 o'clock for what promises to be another terrific talk. Thank you again, Patrick, and we look forward to seeing everybody on the 14th at 4 o'clock. Bye-bye now.